When everyone was inside, Kajios took Ninin to bed. They were both tired after the stress. Joven knew that Kajios wouldn't sleep well. He never did when he thought Ninin would be taken from him again. The horror in Kajios' eyes when he had realized that Joven had muzzled him and was holding him back as Saphir came in with a syringe and needle made Joven sick to the stomach. Not more so than what Aquino had told him, though. The brutality and horrors that Vexen had gone through made him feel the need to empty the contents of his stomach. "Do you like to sleep alone or with someone?" Joven asked Vexen as they entered retreat. "I don't like sleeping alone," Vexen answered quietly. His voice was soft and shook very slightly, as though he were afraid every word spoken would hurt him. "Sleep in my room," Joven told him, glancing towards Miranda. "You too. I'll get extra mattresses." He led them all to his room and went down the hall to drag 2 twin-size mattresses in. He laid them on the floor with a foot of space in between them, and then went back out and down the hall. Grabbing several blankets and some pillows, he made his way back to the room and tossed them on the beds. Vexen stood in the corner of the room, his head lowered slightly. Joven frowned and went over to him. A checklist ran through his head. The poor boy had been fed, healed of most of his illnesses and wounds, and clothed with a new shirt. Some of the scars still showed on his arms, and he noticed one of the more recent ones was bleeding again. Bath, Joven thought. He needed a bath. Now that Joven could get a closer look, he could see that Vexen's hair had been washed hurriedly, and had been given a quick, sloppy cut. Signs of matting were hidden by the combed-over outside. Joven sighed slowly and tried to think of anyone he knew who could do a good haircut. He thought Andorra could, but that would be something he could worry about tomorrow. Vexen looked like he needed a bath, and sleep, and many other things. "Is it okay if you take a bath?" Joven asked him. "I don't like baths," Vexen whispered, looking up at him shakily. "Well, you need to get cleaned up." Joven trailed off, thinking. "Would it be alright if I used a washcloth to clean you up?" "I don't understand." Vexen looked confused and a little scared. Miranda took on the job of explaining what a bath was while Joven went into his bathroom and turned the water on. From the other room he heard Vexen start whimpering, and he frowned, returning. The Truth Powerling had huddled himself up in the corner of the room, eyes huge at the sound of the water running. I don't understand," he whimpered. What did I do wrong?" "Nothing." Joven frowned and crouched down in front of him. "We're not going to hurt you, Vexen, I promise." Vexen looked at Joven shakily. "You can use your powers on me," Joven told him, "and I will tell you again." Vexen nodded slowly, blinking his eyes. They switched from terrified deep blue to perfect mirrors. Joven stared into Vexen's eyes, which resulted in him looking into his own eye. "I promise that no one in this room will hurt you," Joven murmured. "Ever." "True," Vexen stammered, looking relieved. He blinked his eyes back to normal. "Good." Joven held out his hand. "I'm gonna give you a bath, and I promise I won't hurt you." Vexen slowly took Joven's hand, allowing him to be pulled to his feet. Joven had noticed that the poor boy was stiff about his right arm. He wouldn't lift his elbow much higher than a couple inches, and seemed to like to keep it right against his side. Joven remembered what Aquino had told him. He was beaten. They took his arm and forced him to lay it across a slab of concrete. Then they tried to make him lie. When he didn't lie, they crushed his fingers. When he didn't lie again, they crushed his knuckles. They inched their way up his arm, crushing it every time he didn't lie. It simply healed wrong. Every movement he makes with it is painful. The Fire Eater led Vexen into the bathroom, where he helped him remove his shirt without him having to move his arm too much. The boy stared at the running bath, and he began to shake. "Wait," he gasped, falling back against the wall. He covered his head with his arms, trembling. No more. Jovan frowned and crouched down beside him, murmuring, "Vexen." "I'm sorry," Vexen whimpered, his eyes rolling. "I'm sorry." "You don't have anything to be sorry about." Jovan turned to the bath and turned it off, grabbing a washcloth and soaking it in warm water. He returned to Vexen, showing him the cloth. Vexen stared at it wildly, breaths heaving in his chest. "I won't hurt you," Jovan told him. Vexen blinked his eyes, changing them to mirrors. He stared at Jovan shakily, looking like he wanted to run but couldn't. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jovan murmured. "I'm just going to put this on your arm. It's wet and the water's warm. All right?" Vexen nodded, whimpering weakly. "True." Jovan gently laid the cloth on Vexen's arm. The boy immediately let out a shriek, jerking away from it, falling onto his side, sobbing. Jovan quickly pulled the cloth off and threw it into the corner of the room. He grabbed a dry one and lifted Vexen into a sitting position, drying his arm quickly. Vexen shook heavily, going quiet once more. Jovan put an arm around his shoulders, sitting with Vexen leaned up against his chest. "Shawnee," Jovan crooned. Vexen lifted a hand and held onto the folds of Jovan's shirt, trembling as though he were freezing. Jovan put both arms around the boy, laying his chin on top of his head. "Shh, and Lorison, and Lura." It took a while to calm the poor truth powerling down, but he managed it, with some help from Dallas and Miranda. Eventually, Jovan decided getting him wet was not an option, at least not tonight. He almost wished he could cross the hall and ask Neenan if he knew any way they could start trying to get him used to water, but there was no rush, and he didn't want to bother them after what had already happened. Jovan got Vexen to his feet and back into the bedroom, letting him sit on his bed instead of the mattress on the floor. He realized with his shaky frame and lack of much strength in his right arm, he would have a hard time getting up from lying on the floor. He asked Miranda to turn around and not look so he could get Vexen dressed. Dallas had to help him, as he couldn't hold Vexen on his feet and pull pants onto him at the same time. Vexen clung to Dallas as she held him up. As he dressed him, Jovan began having flashbacks of someone who had been like this. Kajios. He had disappeared for nearly a year, about 9 months. For the longest time, everyone had assumed he was dead for good, and then one day he had simply reappeared. Jovan had found him stumbling around, dazed, in the woods, and had thought of leaving him there out of spite. However, Kajios had clung to him upon seeing him, and sobbed into his chest, and broke down in 2 seconds flat. Jovan couldn't have left him. Jovan scowled. He hated old memories getting dragged up. He tried to think of why Vexen hated water. Maybe they could get around it somehow? He searched through his head for the information that Aquino had given him. Saskia would make him drink 1 bottle of water for every time he didn't lie. If he didn't drink it in under 2 minutes, he was whipped across his chest. He drank until he was waterlogged, throwing it up. He couldn't urinate. If he did, they whipped him from his hips down. He has a urinary tract infection from holding it all. His bladder ruptured 4 times. They had a healer to heal him just enough to keep him alive. They put him in warm water and told him to lie. When he didn't, they moved him immediately to an ice bath, waited until his lips turned blue, and then put him back in the hot bath to dry again. Jovan grimaced and rubbed his face in his hands. So they couldn't give the kid a bath or water to drink. Vexen looked at his new clothes with curiosity, and Jovan noticed that one of the scars on his arm was bleeding. He frowned and wandered into the bathroom, grabbing bandages and some gauze. He returned and cleaned the blood up as best he could, and then bandaged it. Vexen watched with mild curiosity, his eyes still mirrored. "Bedtime," Jovan told everyone. "It's late. Dallas, me and you will sleep on the floor. Miranda can sleep on the bed with Vexen, if that's all right with both of you." The two merely nodded, and Jovan made sure that they were comfortable before he finally allowed himself to wander into his closet and get his black pajama pants on. He normally slept with no shirt on because it simply got too hot sitting still for so long. He ambled back into the bedroom and pushed the mattresses on the floor together, slumping down beside Dallas. He wrapped an arm around her and laid his head back against the pillow, sighing quietly. Luckily, Vexen seemed to have no problem with being allowed to sleep. It seemed as though he had missed out on a lot of that as well, for he was out cold in less than a minute. Jovan didn't sleep most of the night, but then again, he normally didn't. He just closed his eye and drifted in and out of sleep as he normally did. Years of being betrayed, attacked, ambushed, and living in the Dak forest had made him extremely light sleeper. The only time he ever got a good night's sleep was when Kajios was around. This thought was strange to him, of course. He should be even more wary of the hapless vampire that had repeatedly attempted to kill him, but Jovan truly felt as though he could sleep heavy with Kajios around. Kajios, too, had been attacked too many times in peaceful sleep to be able to sleep heavy. He slept light, though not as lightly as Jovan. Light enough to where he could hear Ninen's whimpers and his slight shifts, his heartbeat speed up, his breaths quicken. He could wake up and then wake Ninen with an excuse, like he was going to get a midnight snack. He never left Ninen without waking and telling him first, not even for a couple minutes. Jovan sighed slowly. Sleep was evading him more than usual this night. He reached over to his bag, which sat against the wall. He dug around in it for a moment, trying not to move much so he wouldn't jar Dallas around. He pulled out his cell phone and called Kajios. The groggy vampire answered with a mumble. "Hello?" "Hey, Bat," Jovan muttered. "Did you send Dyron after Saskia?" "Yep." Kajios yawned from the other end. "That all?" "Did you get confirmed hit yet?" "No, but I'll tell you when figure it out." "Accent, Bat." Kajios cleared his throat. I'll call as soon as they give me confirmation." "All right." There was a moment of silence on Kajios' end, and for a second Jovan wondered if he had hung up or fallen asleep. "Can't sleep either," Kajios asked finally. "Never can." Jovan sighed heavily. "I better go," Kajios mumbled. "I don't want to wake Ninen up." "All right," Jovan replied. "Night." "Night, Mihal." Kajios hung up and Jovan shut his cell phone, setting it down by his side. He was just closing his eye and about to doze off when it rang loudly. He cussed and flipped it open, hissing into it, "Forget to say I love you, dear?" Dyron called it off, Kajios told him, all joking aside. Jovan frowned. "Why?" "He went into Saski's chambers and found him slaughtered on the bed. He says it looks like someone stabbed a sword into his mouth and dragged it all the way down his pelvis. They did it in a way where he was alive the entire time. He died from blood loss and shock just 20 minutes ago." Jovan stared up at the ceiling, silence heavy between the two of them. "Any evidence on who?" Jovan asked. "Jovan." Kajios' voice shook a bit. "His jaw was cut in half. Do we really want to know who it was?" "Yes," Jovan frowned. "I do." "Fine. I'll send Dyron after it." "All right. Night, Mihal." "I'll schwöre nimmer, Mihal." They hung up once more, and Jovan closed his eye. Saskia was dead. That was enough to allow him to sleep a little better this night.